In this video, we're going to be multiplying rational expressions, and it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. Factor, simplify, and find what x is not allowed to be. So we're going to start off by factoring our first numerator. And here we can see that there's a common factor of 5x, so we can take a 5x out, and that's going to leave us with a 3x plus 1. Now we can factor that first denominator. We see that there's also a common factor of x. That's going to leave us with an x squared minus 3x minus 18. But here we can't be done because we can continue to factor x squared minus 3x minus 18. We want to know what will break down, what will negative 18 break down to be if I wanted to multiply negative 18 but add to a negative 3. And those factors are negative 6 and positive 3. So we can actually rewrite these factors as x times x minus 6 times x plus 3, because remember that x still has to come down. And so now we have the factors of our first numerator and our first denominator, and we can actually write those in fraction form right now. By writing them down now, we end up making it easier for us to not get lost, because we're going to have a lot of numbers and a lot of factors sitting around everywhere. So now we're ready to factor our second numerator, and here we see that we have a leading coefficient of 1. So we want to know what two numbers will multiply to negative 15 but will add to that negative 2. And we're going to choose negative 5 and positive 3. So this second numerator actually ends up having factors of x minus 5 and x plus 3. And so now we can factor our second denominator. This one's going to be a little more challenging because our leading coefficient is not a 1. Now there's lots of ways to factor when our leading coefficient isn't a 1, but I prefer the box method. Sometimes I call it a disco box because it gets pretty colorful as I'm going through, but we'll just keep this one nice and simple. So I'm going to take the first term and put it in the first box, and I take the last term and I put it in the last box, and then I multiply those two numbers together. Okay, so just to be clear, I'm multiplying my 3x squared and my negative 3. When I do that, I get a negative 9. And I'm going to break that down and try and find two numbers that will multiply to negative 9, but will add to negative 8. And I should be clear really quick that although we're multiplying the 3x squared and the negative 3, I neglected to write down the x squared. But it's still technically there. What happens is that x squared gets broken apart, and one of the x's comes here, and one of the x's comes there. So let's go back to breaking apart negative 9. So what two numbers can you multiply to get negative 9, but add to get negative 8? We're going to choose negative 9 and positive 1. Now those two numbers split, negative 9 and positive 1. Now I'm going to see what numbers columns and rows have in common. So let's start with our first row. So we look at this row right here, and what does that row have in common? Well, they both have a 3, and they both have an x. So we'll write down 3x as the numbers we're pulling out. What about the second row? They don't really have anything in common. So for there, we're just going to write down a 1. Well, what about this first column? It looks like they only have an x in common. So we're going to go ahead and write down x. And the second column, well, they both have a 3 in common, and they both actually have a negative. So when that happens, we pull out the negative. When in doubt, if the top number or the first number is a negative, that's how you know it's okay to bring out a negative. So these four pink numbers represent our two factors, which are 3x plus 1 and x minus 3. So we can go ahead, now that we've finished factoring that, and we can write out our second fraction with its factors so that we're ready to move on to step 2, which is simplify. Now remember, when we're simplifying, it's important that things that are inside of parentheses stay together. So what that means is that just because this number has a 1, or an x rather, just because I can take an x here, I can't take that x from here because one of the x's was inside of parentheses and the other was not. So that can't happen. What is important to point out is that even though the 5 and the x are next to each other, they're technically their own separate groups. We usually just don't write them separately, like in parentheses. So let's see what we can cross out. So as I'm looking, I do happen to notice that there is a 3x plus 1 in the numerator and a 3x plus 1 in the denominator. So I can cross those out. I also see that there's an x plus 3 in the denominator and an x plus 3 in the numerator. So I can cross those out. I also see one more thing I can cross out, which is the plain x on the numerator and the plain x in the denominator. And I don't see anything else that's left that we can cross off. So we're going to write down what's left, and if we happen to come across something that we can still cross off, we'll do it. But if not, then we're ready to move on to our third step. So it looks like we have a 5 left in the numerator, and we have an x minus 5 left in the numerator, and we have an x minus 6 in the denominator, and an x minus 3 in the denominator. Well, I can't see anything else that I can cross off, so now we just have to do our third step and find what is x not allowed to be. Now remember, in order to do that, we're looking to the denominator and the things we crossed out in the denominator. In the denominator, we crossed out an x, we crossed out an x plus 3, and we crossed out a 3x plus 1. So in order to find what x is not allowed to equal, we need to set each of these equal to 0 and then solve for x. So here we see that x equals 0. There's not really a change there. Here we see x equals -3, and after solving on our third one, we see that x cannot equal, or the x equals rather, to start, a -1/3. So these three numbers here are the numbers that x is not allowed to be. So we're going to go ahead and write those. So we're going to say that x cannot be a 0, and x cannot be a -3, and x cannot be a -1/3. And because we've factored completely and we're simplified, we found all of the things that x is not allowed to be, we are done, and this right here is our solution.